Lucas Tomlinson has more on this from the Pentagon. Lucas?
Well, Sandra, it's the fourth long-range missile test for the Air Force this year. The unarmed Minuteman III missile blasted off from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California early this morning and flew over 4,000 miles, hitting a target in the Pacific. Now, unlike North Korea, who fails to warn others before its tests, threatening airliners and shipping, the Air Force says a notice was given before today's launch. There are 400 nuclear missiles at bases in Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. Yesterday, the Secretary of State says he hopes for better relations with Pyongyang.
And we're trying to convey to the North Koreans, we are not your enemy, we're not your threat, but you are presenting an unacceptable threat to us, and we have to respond.
Officials say North Korea still has to do a number of things before it can hit the United States, such as 1, hit a target, 2, have a re-entry vehicle survive a trip back to Earth from space, and 3, miniaturize a nuclear warhead and place it atop a missile. Now, Sandra, North Korea has had a record-setting pace of missile tests, and they want to achieve those goals with these tests.
All right, Lucas Tomlinson, thank you. Lucas, by the way, North Korea and the U.S. aren't the only ones testing missiles. Who else in Asia, Lucas?
Well, Sandra, just one day after North Korea's record-setting ballistic missile test, China fired 20 missiles at mock-ups of American THAAD anti-ballistic missile systems and mock-ups of Air Force F-22 stealth jets. Now, China has long protested the U.S.'s THAAD missile battery in South Korea. China's missile test coincided with Beijing's Army Day, parading 12,000 troops along with dozens of tanks, jets, and missiles, the first time Beijing celebrated this day with a parade. Now, China has the largest army in the world and now has as many destroyers, cruisers, and submarines as the U.S. Navy. And Secretary of State Tillerson says the U.S. and China are at a pivot point in history, one of the reasons that he and Defense Secretary Mattis are on Capitol Hill this afternoon to discuss next steps.
All right,
Sandra?
Lucas Tomlinson, thank you.
So the administration does have a name for their North Korea policy. It's called maximum pressure and engagement. So under that heading, technically, you could see the continuity of maximum pressure, what we just heard from Senator Graham. And in terms of the offer for negotiations with conditions from Secretary Tillerson, that could be a part of the engagement. But I think the way that the message is coming out, it's a bit confusing on the surface of it. But right now, there definitely is a priority focus on using every tool possible under the maximum pressure heading.
It is a bit confusing. Is it confusing for U.S. allies in the region? What do South Korea and Japan think? And do they believe Rex Tillerson speaks for the Trump administration?
Sure. I think the allies have been following up on every single tweet as well as statement. I've heard that in the South Korean government side, there is an officer whose dedicated job is to monitor the president's tweets. So from that perspective, there is a lot of direct follow-up. But I think what we're seeing is a sense of panic and urgency in the United States. We're looking at North Korean capabilities with ICBM, long-range ballistic missiles here, and potentially nuclear-tipped ICBMs that could essentially threaten and target the content of the United States. So that part is different.
North Korea and America first. You know, because of the America First policy under President Trump, is there fear in Japan, fear in South Korea that Donald Trump is more willing to pursue the military option because, as Lindsey Graham put it, it would lead to mass casualties over there, not on U.S. soil?
Well, there is concern,
Yeah.
and I think with these type of statements, there's always careful follow-up by the U.S. side. But right now, we're looking at a situation where the North Korean program is so far advanced, you know, farther than many people had estimated by this time. So with that, I think, is a sense of trying to make up for lost ground. There's a lot of focus on ballistic missile defenses and all those things, but we're continuing to see the testing of these capabilities, and so that gap and that perceived gap is growing.
U.S., China, international pressure on China. Let's say if there are additional sanctions passed targeting Chinese financial institutions that do business with North Korea, what impact is that going to have on the North Korean crisis?
So first off, with this approach, it's called secondary sanctions.
Yeah.
The idea of, as you mentioned, to target Chinese companies, banks, and Chinese entities. But if you look at it, these things will take time. And I think the sense of urgency with what's happening with the growing North Korean capabilities, even if there is a forward movement and the Chinese do implement more sanctions along the lines of what the U.S. is looking for, that time lag, I don't think is going to produce that immediate result that many are expecting.
What do you believe is the most constructive path forward?
I think right now we're seeing a North Korean nuclear weapons program, both on the ballistic missile side, the ICBM development, and the nuclear weapons development side of things, that is so far advanced that the room for dialogue and negotiation The concern is that there really isn't room, that North Korea is going to move towards full nuclear weapons capability. There's a nuclear ICBM. And at that point, perhaps initiate discussions that would be nuclear arms control. That is something that the other parties are not interested in.
So we're past the point of talks?
That's a concern among my community. The group of North Korea watchers is that the North Korean development is so far paced that why stop now from the North Korean perspective?
So the options that are left are regime change, military option, international pressure?
And sanctions. There's a tremendous amount of focus on sanctions, but I think given the advanced state and given how there is a time lag usually with the implementation of sanctions producing the results that many are expecting, we're in a situation where if we continue on the current pattern and the current trend lines, then it does increase the likelihood of some kind of military action, and we're very concerned about that.
In the meantime, you're basically saying North Korea will be a nuclear power. It's just a matter of when.
This is a consensus in the North Korea watcher community, and how the United States and other countries address that is a source of concern. The Chinese have been very concerned as well, but I think their approach is to remain calm, to try to initiate negotiations when possible, and we just heard the Chinese ambassador to the UN basically saying this is up to the United States and North Korea to solve it. This isn't China's problem.
When we report stories like our testing an unarmed missile today is the reaction of the North Koreans when they call this sort of thing that we do. And this was about a missile that flew from the Air Force Base in California right into the Pacific, that's provocative, that's a provocation. Ignoring all the times they've been launching missiles left and right. In fact, Kim Jong-un now launching more of them than his father and his grandfather combined, and yet we're the provocative ones. To former UN spokesman Rick Grinnell. Rick, good to have you back again. What did you make of that reaction?
Look, Neil, we have known for a very long time that North Korea was trying to get this capability. They were basically allowed to garner this capability almost unfettered during the Obama administration. I wrote years ago that when they did a missile test that was a rocket launched into space, that was a sounding of the alarm because it could reach Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, the West Coast. The East Coast really didn't react, but now that it's getting closer to the East Coast, suddenly all you elites on the Washington, D.C., New York City corridor are alarmed by this. We've known this for years that this is happening. I think we got to get very serious about sanctions. I think there's still time for diplomacy. Sanctions are not going to be easy because the only sanctions that I believe that will work right now are banking sanctions on the country of China. That's not without pain, as you know.
You know, Rick, I'm glad you said that on the country of China, not one Chinese financial entity. And why is that important? Because when we went after this one and this lesser player, you're smart at this than I am. Why is that significant?
Well, look, the Chinese companies are very good at just changing the name. So if we sanction company A, company B is going to all of a sudden arrive as a subsidiary or a new company, and they're not under the sanctions so that they can continue the work. So what we have to be able to do is go after China for not doing enough to clamp down on their companies. And by the way, Neil, if you just look at this year alone, where 12 missile tests have been conducted by North Korea, and then you compare that to the increased trade between China and North Korea this year alone, it's shocking.
Well, that there's more of it.
There's a lot more trade. The trade has increased
so they're lying through
this quarter, so the Chinese are ignoring us.
Right.
They're totally ignoring us.
All right, I got that. I'm a little slow, but I got it. Rick, help me with this. We always wait to see what the Chinese are going to do if we do anything. And we've always been afraid to get too rough with China because, well, they own a lot of our debt. Not as much as they used to. They could sell that. Interest rates would rise. I don't think that would happen. I don't know about you because they have nowhere else to go. But what do you make of the idea that a trade war would jar a lot of Americans because all of a sudden they're facing much higher prices for goods that they buy at Walmart or what have you, and that unless the president makes it very compelling in case that there's going to have to be some sacrifice here to send the Chinese a message, how would that go down?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's not without pain. It's extremely painful by putting sanctions on China. If it came to that, I think we need to be prepared to put the sanctions on. But I think that if we announced to China that you're either going to do business with the United States or you're going to do business with North Korea, that we would see a change of behavior pretty quickly. If we didn't see it, we should be prepared to immediately implement those sanctions. Look, at the end of the day, the first question is this a threat to our national security? If it's a threat to our national security, if we are concerned about having members of Americans or members of the U.S. military taken out, killed by a missile launch from North Korea, then I think that we're going to have to calculate that some higher prices at Walmart are going to be inevitable.
You know China very well. I guess you know Germany pretty well. Just hearing these rumors that the president is looking at you to do something there, like an ambassadorship or anything, any truth to that?
Look, I don't have anything to announce today. The one thing that I will say is that I was a delegate for Trump. I was an early supporter for President Trump. I'm still a supporter of his. I think that changing Washington requires a lot of hands on deck, and I'll do whatever I can to help change Washington.
Are you comfortable with the German language, or?
That's all I'm going to say, Neil.
Okay.
But good try.
Yeah, I tried. Thought at a weak moment I'd get you there. All right, Rick Grinnell, always good seeing you, my friend.